Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. In this session, we will discuss with donors and funders on how we can keep micronutrients and nutrition on the agenda of donors and governments, despite so many other priorities. And this is a question that has become even more relevant this year with the COVID-19 pandemic posing an immediate threat on malnutrition in all its forms, with potential implications for the future generation. And while at the same time, ODA and national budgets are under pressure due to the economic crisis caused by this pandemic, as we heard in the session on COVID and malnutrition yesterday as well. So what we learned quickly this year is that in order for us to continue to make progress, especially in times when funding is short, we need to strengthen our relationships and partnerships. We need to step beyond our own shadow. We need to convene and work together like never before. We need to find the common ground, speak with one voice, and take collective action. We need to work on true inclusive collaborations and listen and learn from the experts in the countries on the ground. And we need to base our decisions on how to move forward on data and science. The Micronutrient Forum has stepped up to this challenge with many others and has played this neutral convening role in bringing partners together on challenging nutrition agendas. We are an independent knowledge broker because we do not implement programs, we do not develop policies, and do not research ourselves. This is why we can attract leading experts in the field to collaborate on areas for which collective action is required. That was visible in our leadership role together with GAIN and funded by CIF in the establishment of the Standing Together for Nutrition Consortium. The complexity of the COVID-19 crisis on all forms of malnutrition required us to work together with nutrition, food systems, health and economic experts, to bring in country expertise and the power of inclusive knowledge, to jointly estimate the impact of the pandemic on malnutrition and agree on recommendations to build back better. It was also visible in one of our other priority areas, which was also discussed in the session on the global state of micronutrients yesterday, the micronutrient data gap. We will not be able to measure progress, target interventions, and hold countries accountable without good representative data on micronutrient status. With support of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Micronutrient Forum, therefore, brought stakeholders together to jointly develop a strategic plan for systematically addressing these issues together. And it is visible in areas where we need to work collectively to keep topics on the agenda, ensuring that micronutrient nutrition remains included in the global nutrition agenda during the upcoming Nutrition for Growth and Food Systems Summits. Our recent Lancet commentary outlines the case for explicitly including micronutrient malnutrition in the global nutrition agenda and ensuring that the community has an effective resource and advocate for effectively addressing this triple burden of malnutrition, which is also featuring in this year's edition of UNICEF's State of the World's Children report that was launched yesterday. Another area where we have seen success in collective work on advocacy is on maternal micronutrient supplements, or MMS, where the Micronutrient Forum, with financial support from Kirk Humanitarian, has convened 43 stakeholders from 27 organizations to accelerate the current momentum of MMS adoption and scale-up. And we will hear more about the Healthy Mothers, Healthy Babies initiative in a session starting at 11:45 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Friday. So these were some examples of the current work of the forum and what we can bring to partners, but we can and will not do this alone. We all share a passion of a world without malnutrition in all its forms, and we cannot be successful in achieving and delivering on this mission if we continue to operate in isolation and work within silos. We need to reach out to other stakeholders outside our own comfort zone and outside this conference. We need to explore innovative funding opportunities, and we need to push this agenda forward together. And with this, I would like to hand over to Eileen Kennedy to start the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Saskia. I am delighted to welcome everyone to this session of the Micronutrient Forum, which I'm going to read because I don't want to get it wrong. How to keep micronutrients as a priority with shifting global, national, and donor priorities, and a particular emphasis on an enabling environment. I find that term, enabling environment, interesting because in a number of different forums that I've participated over the past 5-10 years, people talk about the enabling environment in very different ways. And we'll do a deep dive into this. As in the past, a political appointee in United States government, we looked at enabling environment from very different ways. So it'd be interesting to see what our panelists have to say about this. Anyway, the lineup today is we will have a overview presentation by Dr. Kelly Brunell, and then we'll move on to a panel, which Dr. Brunell will also participate. So let me, I apologize in advance. I have a terrible cold, so I'm quite congested. But anyway, be that as it may. I'd like to introduce Dr. Kelly Brunell. I remember years ago when I did a lot of, in government, a lot of what I think people would call presentations that was a talking head, meaning I did an intro, whatever, and there wasn't a lot of substance. So my son, Daniel, my youngest child, said to me once that no one ever remembers the introductions you do, Mom, which is probably true. So let's keep them short. With Kelly, that's hard because Kelly and I probably go back 20, 30 years of interaction, including, Kelly, you may not remember this, a little bit of some sparring back and forth on issues. But what I remember about those days is I always walked away from those interactions having learned something from Kelly. So now I'll do the formal introduction to Kelly, which is Kelly is the director of the World Food Policy Center at Duke University. And for the next 15 minutes, he'll provide what I see as a framing exercise on these issues. And then I'll go on to introduce the panel. But with that, take it away, Kelly.
Thank you, Eileen. And thanks so much for allowing me to participate in this event. I think I'm going to learn a great deal from the other panelists, so I look forward to participating. So I'll be speaking today about how to keep the micronutrient agenda front and center. And one of the ways to think about doing that is to find ways to better move from evidence to action. And generally, people in the field are concerned about this issue almost no matter what topic they tend to focus on. And it's something that I've thought about a lot in my own work. Earlier in my career, I faced the kind of frustration that many researchers face, that there seemed to be a strong scientific basis for making certain policy decisions that then didn't get made, or even changes in practice on the ground. It could be informed by research that was going on, but there wasn't a very strong connection. And I began thinking with my colleagues what we might do about this and whether there might be a way to better connect science with policy and to harness the power that science and research has in order to inform policy. We were frustrated in the area I was working in, which is more on macronutrients, but working on public health, nutrition, and obesity prevention. But I think this problem occurs in most fields, at least from talking to other people who work in different areas. One of the problems that I think happens is that the scientific field tends to be pretty inward looking. And this begins with the way it conceptualizes the mere concept of impact. If you ask scientists, are they having impact, what they usually jump to are how many times their papers are getting cited. When people get promoted in academic settings, it's the H-index, it's the number of citations, but basically that's a measure of how much other scientists are citing your work, not how much impact it's having in the outside world. So that inward-looking thing, I think, is one limitation that the scientific field has. And we were, in that trap ourselves, but tried to figure out how to get out of it by developing a different kind of a model for doing science. And so we came up with a model that we referred to as strategic science. And that's not to replace traditional programmatic science, but to be a companion to it. And the model of strategic science begins by asking who are the change agents around a particular topic. And change agents are rarely other scientists, but they're people, of course, in policy-making positions. And depending on the topic that you're working on, change agents could be legal authorities. Somebody may need to be sued, for example. Corporate players might be an example of that. They could be, in the United States, legal authorities such as the state attorneys general. It could be the press if public opinion is what needs to shift. And obviously elected leaders, people ahead of regulatory agencies, and the usual people are on that list too. But we begin by asking ourselves, who's in a position to do something about this problem that we're dealing with? And then once the change agents are identified, then that can help drive the scientific agenda. Because some of the most important questions are not ones that other scientists are recommending get addressed, but ones that exist out there in the policy ether. And so the change agents can be communicated with, and we can ask, what sort of information would be helpful in your world? What kind of information gaps would it be helpful to fill? What sort of barriers are you facing? What are your opponents saying about a particular issue? And in those cases, very often interesting ideas come about for research that we wouldn't necessarily have even thought about. And sometimes it can lead to some very quick and easily done studies that can have pretty profound policy impacts. Then the next stage in that strategic science process is to find a way to communicate that information back to the change agents. So you get an information loop going where the scientists are informed by the change agents. That helps drive the agenda. The information gets communicated back to the change agents in ways that can be helpful for them making changes in their arena. So that's the fundamental model of strategic science. My colleague Christina Roberto and I wrote a brief paper in the Lancet on this, and if anybody would like a copy of that, please be in touch and I'll be happy to send it. And I thought I would give several case studies to show this in action. And again, these aren't in the micronutrient arena, but hopefully the concepts will apply and the basic ideas of how to carry out strategic science might have applicability across areas. So the first case study I'd like to give has to do with putting calories on restaurant menus as a means of improving diet in the general population. In the United States, the first jurisdiction to propose and then enact such regulations was New York City. New York City was sued twice by the restaurant industry to block this, but they finally prevailed in the courts and the regulation went into effect. And of course, once a public health measure like this happens, somebody goes first and you hope lots of other players might go second, third, and fourth. So in the United States, several cities came out of the block after New York City. So Miami, Nashville, and Philadelphia started considering it. But the state of California did as well. And that would have been considered a major public health victory at the time because a whole state would have been enacting legislation. You wouldn't have to go city by city. The governor at the time said that the only way he would sign legislation around menu labeling was if the restaurant industry and the public health community could agree on the language of a bill. In this horse trading process, one of the concessions that the restaurant industry wanted was to exempt drive-in windows from having the calorie values placed on the boards. And their rationale was pretty bogus. They said that there only so much room on these boards, as if they couldn't build a bit bigger board, but that's the rationale they used. And so one morning, it was about 10 o'clock in the morning, I was in Connecticut at the time at Yale University, and a friend from California was up early and called me and told me about this horse trading concession interest that the industry had. And I thought, it seems like there are a lot of people that go, at least in the United States, go through these drive-in windows. I didn't know how many, but it seemed like it was a lot. And legislation that would miss that fraction of the intended audience would not be effective as you'd hope it would be. So I canceled some meetings I had around lunchtime that day, and I got a clipboard, and I drove in my car and sat across the street from a McDonald's in Guilford, Connecticut. And I just counted the number of people who drove through or walked into the restaurant. And it wasn't high science, it was just me and my clipboard, but it turned out to be about 60% of people were driving through rather than walking into the restaurant. So then I put my graduate students onto this, and they did a proper study and later got it published and peer-reviewed, of course, where they did thousands of observations, reliability checks, different meals of the day, different fast food restaurants, etc. And it turned out that the final number was fairly close to 60%. And that little study, which took several weeks to do and probably cost $50 for some clipboards, ended up having substantial policy impact because the numbers got fed right back to the advocacy people in California. They then went to the legislators who were working on this piece of legislation and said, if you provide this exemption, the concession that the industry wants, you're missing 60% of the intended population. And that was enough ammunition, that little study we did, in order to block that particular concession in California. And then that same thing was true of national legislation that occurred later in the United States. So that's strategic study example number one. Case study number two has to do with children's food marketing. My colleagues at the time we were working on this were led by Jennifer Harris, had an impressive team of researchers funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to examine the amount of food marketing directed at children and to establish what is being marketed, who is being targeted by the marketing, and how much of the marketing there is. And if you imagine creating a list of the ranging of the nutrition profile of cereals from the major companies, and you rank order them from worst down to the bottom of the list, which would be the best nutrition profiles. And the ranking would be how much fiber is in the cereals, how much sugar, etc. And then next to that, you superimpose a list of how much marketing of those particular cereals is being done to children. And once you do that sort of superimposition of these two lists, you find a nearly perfect match, that the worst products are being most aggressively marketed to children. Now, when we did this research, we wanted it to have important impact. We wanted the press to cover this. We wanted policymakers to know about it because of possible ways to restrict food marketing directed at children. And also we wanted parents and families to know about this so parents would know that the worst products in the company's profiles are being most aggressively marketed to their children. It's especially true of children of color. And the marketing is being done in many ways that sort of circumvent parents' knowledge that the children are being marketed to. So we thought, what would be the industry's defense of their practices? And it wasn't too hard to know that because there had been a little writing done by people within the industry. And of course, we'd been on panels with them and things like that and knew what the industry defense would be. And we figured it would have they would have a three-point defense. One is to make the argument that eating breakfast is a good thing. And that turns out to be true. Second, they argue that cereals can be a very good way to deliver nutrients. And that turns out to be true as well. But third, that children won't consume the cereals and therefore not get the needed nutrition unless the cereals have lots of sugar. Now that occurred to us to be a predictable industry defense and a testable hypothesis, so we quickly did a study on this to see whether the industry assumption was true. So we did a study where we had children randomly assigned to eat breakfast under one of two conditions. One was a condition where they ate a low sugar version of a cereal, like plain cornflakes would be an example. And then the other condition is the children would get a high sugar version of that same cereal, like Frosted Flakes. The children could put as much cereal in the bowl as they wanted. They could add as much milk as they wanted. There was a sugar bowl adjacent to the cereal, so they could add sugar if they wished. And then there were also some berries that they could add to the cereal if they wanted to. And what we found was that the cereals that had low sugar, the children had just about the right nutrient profile that you'd like to see a child have for breakfast. They had low sugar because they got the better version of the cereal, and they voluntarily added fruit to it which provided a nutrition boost and not a lot of sugar. And they ended up with a positive nutrition profile. The children that got the high sugar versions of the cereal consume way more calories than what you'd hope a child would have for breakfast. So the industry defense, especially the part 3 of their argument that children would only eat sugared cereals, turned out not to be true. So when we then released the overall report about the amount of marketing being done, the press would call the CEOs of Kellogg and General Mills and the other companies and say, why are you marketing your worst products to children? They would go through their 3-point defense, but the press would say, but yeah, these people at Yale did this study that found that that wasn't true. And it really disarmed the industry's chief argument that, the chief defense for why they're marketing high sugar cereals to children. Now, again, that was not a complicated study. It had pretty straightforward results, ended up published in a good journal, Pediatrics, but it had direct policy impact because of us addressing the industry's defense. So we were very happy with the impact of that work. And then I'd like to give one other example in an area where I've been working for a number of years on soda taxes. You may know that soda taxes now exist in about 50 countries around the world and a number of cities within the United States. The industry has fought this with every ounce of might they have. They've spent so many millions of dollars around the world fighting these taxes, it would be hard to add it all up. And so what we were asking ourselves, what sort of strategic science could be done to help address these issues? So one was to publish some papers in reputable journals that would bring attention to the issue and provide a scientific and economic basis for why such taxes might be useful. So I published 2 papers with colleagues in 1990, the time when these taxes were really starting to be considered in more detail. We'd written about it many years before then, but the consideration became pretty serious about that time. And one was a piece I wrote with Tom Frieden in the New England Journal of Medicine. At the time, Tom was the health commissioner of New York City, later became the head of our Centers for Disease Control, and then later wrote a paper, another paper in the New England Journal with economists such as Barry Popkin, Walter Willett, nutritional epidemiologists and others, well established in the field, to make both an economic and public health case for why the taxes were important. We also did several other pieces of strategic research that turned out to be pretty helpful. One was we worked with an economist, Tanya Andreeva, who did excellent work in modeling the potential, the projected elasticity of soda consumption given different levels of taxes. So if you tax soda at a certain level, how much reduction in consumption at the population level might you expect? That produced some potential health outcome estimates that turned out to be pretty motivating for health authorities to support the soda taxes. But we found that politicians who were thinking about this sometimes were less concerned about the health benefits than they were about raising a lot of money as revenue from the taxes and how that money might get used to run needed programs. So then Tanya Andreeva, the economist I mentioned before, did another piece of strategic research, which was to produce a calculator that could estimate the amount of revenue that could be made in the United States from every state and the major cities if they use soda taxes at a given level. So if you put in a soda tax at level A, here's how much revenue would be used, level B, it would raise more, etc. And that turned out to be extremely helpful because then the legislators knew exactly how much revenue would likely be raised, and that became important in them estimating that part of the impact for the soda taxes. So when those pieces of research came out and we were able to communicate them back to the officials, then it became helpful in the policies around the world. So those are 3 case studies: menu labeling, children's food marketing, and soda taxes, that try to show in action how this model of strategic research might actually play out. Now, of course, these examples aren't in the micronutrient arena, and I'll have to leave it to you to decide whether the model might apply in those areas. But if we accept the premise that we can strengthen or facilitate the process of moving from evidence to action, and that a different model of science as a companion to the traditional models might be helpful, then we can think about that strategic science model, which, as I said, begins with identifying change agents, then developing a scientific agenda based on information gaps that would be helpful for them to fill, and then communicating the information back to those change agents, all the while attempting to do the best quality science, having it peer-reviewed and published in reputable places. There's an opportunity, I think, to help strengthen that link between science and policy impact. So later on, I'll be happy to answer any questions about it. But again, Eileen, thanks so much, and Klaus, for inviting me to this. I'm really delighted to take part. And I very much look forward to the following presentations.
Thanks, Kelly. I have to say, Kelly, it's refreshing to hear a boots on the ground perspective from an academic. Sometimes you don't hear enough of that. And as you were talking, given the theme of this particular session, several things came to mind. When I started out many moons ago on my career, I regularly would hear comment from scientists, researchers, just a quote, "My research speaks for itself." Or not. Okay, I don't agree with that. But anyway, and when I went into government, whatever I did annoyed somebody. Maybe that's the metric of doing a good job. I don't know. But you talked about the soda tax. One of my early initiatives was in USDA to develop what was called the competitive food rule in schools, better known as the junk food rule. We were sued, and the rule back then came down to prohibiting sale of shaved ice items, sodas, gum, and hard candies. We got sued from both sides. We got sued from advocates who said, well, this rule is not strong enough. As you can imagine, we got sued by the soda manufacturers in the US. We won, but I remember the press, this was pre-email days, the press that we got was in publications in the US like the Washington Post. There were articles about labeled USDA should not be the national nanny. Negative, Kelly, negative. And so, you know, you try to do something, but the reason I'm bringing this up is for everything we try to do, and this is micronutrients and beyond, for everything we try to do, there are always the anti-whatever. And I don't say that they don't have best intentions, but we need to understand for people who are against what we're trying to do, why is that? And let me, before I go to the panel, that one other example. For years, I did a lot of work in Kenya on commercialization of agriculture. And I happened to be at a session in Nairobi where Al Summer and his colleagues from Johns Hopkins were presenting. And it was hot off the press, where their research showed that vitamin A supplementation of preschoolers led to decreased mortality. The Hopkins people left the room. I tell the story all the time. The Hopkins people left the room, and I remember the discussion around this group, researchers. If this finding were true, we would know it already. And I remember thinking, again, I was early on in my career. I remember thinking, why do we do research if we know everything? And so I think in the panel discussion, we'll get into what is enough evidence? And is it bad to be an advocate, or in Europe, I think they call them activists? Is it bad to do that? And kind of what's the line between advocacy, Kelly, and having the right amount of evidence? And so I hope that's going to be a lively discussion in our panel. And I'll now go on to introduce the panel. I'm a little bit shy to introduce the panel because everyone on the panel is so well known. So I will keep the introduction short. In addition to Kelly, who I've already introduced, we'll have 2 minutes from each of the panelists, and then we'll open it up to the audience and an interactive discussion across panelists. So it's my pleasure first, and the order in which I introduce people is the order in which they will present. I'd like to introduce Joel Spicer. Again, needs no introduction. Joel is the president and CEO of Nutrition International. He will be followed by Ali Winoto Subandoro. Sorry, I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but he's a senior nutrition specialist at the World Bank, and a lot of his activities relate to the global financing facility. Then we will be followed by Katarina Lichner, who is the managing director of the Family Lawson Rosenquist Foundation. Then will come Andreas Bluthner, who is director of nutrition at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And finally, but obviously not least, is Gerda Verberg, who is coordinator for the Scaling Up Nutrition Movement, SUN. And with that, I would like to hand over to Joel for his two-minute comments. Thanks, Joel.
Great. Thanks very much, Eileen. And thanks, everyone, Klaus, Micronutrient Forum, and my fellow panelists. It's an honor to be with all of you. And thanks to everyone for tuning in. I'm sorry that Abby Perry can't join us from the United Kingdom. She's an important donor voice, and I'll try and invoke some of her thoughts that she shared also in the preparation of this panel. So with an effort to be a little bit provocative here, but also acknowledging the great progress that's been made in nutrition, I'd like to start by saying, if there was a plan called How to Accelerate the Fall of Nutrition as a Global Priority, we'd be making good progress. So COVID is a health crisis, as we know, but it's set up a massive economic crisis, which has also created the perfect conditions for a malnutrition crisis that we haven't seen before at this level. People are talking about wiping out a decade of progress in less than a year. So significant emergency action is required now and over the medium term to prevent massive damage, particularly for women, adolescents, and children. So we've got to really focus as a community, because if we don't, millions of people are going to be hurt by COVID-accelerated malnutrition on our watch, and that's not acceptable. So at a time where doubling down on nutrition has never been more important, it's also never been more at risk of falling as a global priority. And why do I say this? So the fiscal space of donors and governments is contracting because of the damage from COVID. That's clear. Also, many commitments for nutrition made at N4G before end this year, where we were supposed to have an action forcing moment called Nutrition for Growth Summit, led by Japan, but that has rightly been put off by a year because of COVID. So there's a gap there. The next point was a problem before COVID, but it's coming into more focus with COVID. And that's this. Our messaging and approach as a community is fragmented, sprawling, lacking in focus, and lacking in prioritization. We don't seem to be distinguishing between or prioritizing effort or loading of that effort with regard to the impact horizon, the existing evidence base and its strength, the cost, or the complexity. The problem with that is it causes confusion at the country level about how to prioritize and what to prioritize with scarce resources. The last trip I was on was to Africa in February before COVID lockdown. And it was in Africa. I won't name the country, but I met with a senior government official in the Prime Minister's office whose job was nutrition in that country. And she said, "You nutrition people are confusing us," a statement that still rings in my head to this day. She described her challenge with trying to allocate a very small amount of resources for nutrition and the fact that she was getting multiple conflicting advice. So yes, building out the evidence base is crucial, but we've got to recognize the difference between things that are ready to scale now and things that will be ready in 5 or 10 years to have an effect, or 10 or 20 years. And so many people attending the Micronutrient Forum have dedicated their lives to building the evidence base for critical interventions that are still not getting to people that need them. So we've got to do a better job at leaning in on what works, while at the same time building out the tools we have and looking at how to develop new ones. You know, I'm sure Gerda will agree with me, and she's seen it many times, but many heads of state still don't know the difference between food and nutrition. And the dominant messaging, particularly since COVID, has been about food, famine, hunger, food security. The volume is a little unbalanced, I have to say. So the nutrition voice is fading. And that means that attention and investment are going to fade too and move on to other issues, particularly if there isn't concrete intentional progress against the World Health Assembly targets. And finally, just to say, again, it's unfortunate Abby wasn't able to join us, but in our prep calls, she was sharing her struggles with keeping nutrition high. And if a champion like Abby, who's been working on nutrition in a country that has been a major champion for keeping global nutrition high on the list of priorities, is worried about nutrition falling through the cracks, that's because it is. So it's time to ring the alarm for nutrition and for the nutrition community to look in the mirror and ask what we could be doing differently. As a side note, and that's the end, Eileen, of my remarks, thank you. For people that are listening, I would love in the chat, if you have time, to share one thing you would change about the global nutrition community and how it operates so it could be more effective. What would that one thing be? Thanks, Eileen.
Thanks, Joel. I have a million questions, but we'll leave it to the panel discussion. But let me just prepare the panel for one. I'm not sure the nutrition community speaks with one voice, and that's part of the problem. I remember years ago, Richard Manoff, a la Manoff Group, I was at a presentation that he did. He was a really good communicator, but he said, nutrition is too important to leave to the nutritionists. And let's unpack that later in the discussion. What was he saying there? Now it's my honor to move on to Ali for his comments.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for this. Thanks for this great opportunity. So I would like to speak from the GFF side, right? So for us, the GFF, the investment case is a country-led process to support the country to accelerate progress in key health outcomes, including for example, and also to basically to implement financing and system reforms and to mobilize resource to deliver priority package of services. So the inclusion of micronutrients in the investment case, which is among the most cost-effective interventions, will help these interventions to reach effective coverage at scale and contribute to achieving the objective of the investment case. So now let me go to how is this being done? Is basically to ensure that micronutrient interventions are being prioritized, financed, and monitored in the investment case. Regarding the prioritization, it is very important to ensure that micronutrient interventions are included in the health priority setting process, and we have the updated country-specific information on costing, the available resource, and cost effectiveness. Because all of this will help make the case for the inclusion of micronutrients in the priority service package in the investment case. On financing, some of the important points is first is to focus on increasing financing from all sources, in particular from domestic resources through fiscal policies, and also from other innovative financing instruments. This will be even more challenging in the COVID-19 times because of the tightened fiscal space. And second is to make sure that the available resources are being used efficiently by using the purchasing and payment system to service providers enabled to address the supply side, and then to households to address the demand side. So on the supply side, I would cite one example. For example, would be using results-based payment to providers to improve the availability of micronutrient commodities and enhance community outreach. And then on the demand side, I would cite one example, for example, is to include micronutrient intervention in the household conditional cash transfer program to incentivize increased demand for services. And my last point is clearly on the monitoring system. So it is very crucial to enhance accountability for results. As people said, what gets measured will be get done. So a couple of key points that I would like to highlight here is first to ensure that micronutrient indicators are included in the investment case monitoring framework as tracers to monitor progress. And second, that we're both monitoring financial resources as to how much goes to the micronutrient program, as well as the programmatic, which is the input, outputs, and surface utilization, because it is very crucial to link financing and performance to assess the efficiency of the micronutrient program for budget advocacy. And last but not least is to invest in data system to ensure the availability of high quality and timely routine monitoring data. And this is often quite challenging at the country level, especially for some of the micronutrient indicators. Thank you, Eileen.
Thank you, Ali. You're right on target. I'm thinking of I think it was Drucker who said, we manage what we measure. And if we're not measuring something, we're not managing very well, but we'll get into that in the panel discussion. I'd now like to turn over the podium to Katharina, who provides some comments.
Thank you, Arlene. Dear fellow panelists and dear audience, also a warm welcome from my side. I would like to lead on from Ali's comments about really building a good business case and building a financing model. So I'd like to throw in from my end is, I think we also need to really think about what are we building these models for. So MMS is a pretty wild field. It's currently quite often talked about only in the sense of its impact on pregnancies. What I'd like to contribute is that I think we have to cast that net wider. We have to also think about the critical element of MMS and breastfeeding. If we're in those low resource settings where women are requiring supplementation, because otherwise we're having health issues already at birth, we're going to compound these health issues, even if pregnancies are slightly improved, if we don't support these women during their breastfeeding time, because either the children are not getting enough micronutrients in that critical time of their development, or we're depleting the women to a point where through multiple reproductive cycles, they're actually going to suffer and their health is permanently impaired as well. So I think, and I would like to really also in the context of the current crisis, which I think it's really showing this, is we know that the early days, particularly from pregnancy to about 2 years old, which I think is pretty much covered by the 1,000 Days movement, is a critical formative time for later life health. And it's also a critical time to educate the immune system, form the immune system. If this crisis that we have at the moment, this pandemic shows anything, then it's how important a strong immune system and general health resilience is. And this is what we're really forming at that time of the day, so at that time of the development period. So it's critical to, when we build the investment cases and when we look at the topic, is how far do we want to cast the net? So I would think micronutrients, and really would like to see this embedded into this incredibly important period of the first 1,000 days, because what we're all aiming for and thriving for is that we have children that by the age of 3 that actually can have the potential they deserve. And if we're impairing their neurocognitive and general development already in that period, this can't be recovered, and all the nutritional efforts we do afterwards are not going to recover what we lose at that phase. So that's the first thought I want to bring in. The second thought I want to bring in is that as we're speaking about the what and the why, which is, I think, an important aspect that's contributed by science and the policy, I think we must not leave the how out of the discussion. And I would like to hark back to something you've said, Kelly, and I think it's an important point. Knowledge that is generated is not simply automatically having impact. And there is no direct way from a policy to an effective implementation. There has to be implementation. There has to be a planning step in between there. And we need to understand that how. And this becomes increasingly important as we're facing restricted budgets. So I think it's really important that as we're discussing this topic, we also include the understanding of best practices. How do we operationalize these policies that we have, and on the ground, how do we bring this together, the various aspects of covering a healthy development throughout the first 1,000 days on the operational side. So we're actually able to deliver these targets and build the business cases we need and understand the capital requirements that we need. So I'd like to see this thought through, including breastfeeding, including complementary feeding, and really think also from an operational side, how can we bring this together to really deliver on the ground what's needed to not waste more human capital and ensure healthy babies and mothers. Thank you.
Thank you, Katarina. A lot there to think about. I'd like now to move to Andreas, who provide his comments. Andreas, I think you're muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can, thank you.
Okay, then thanks again, Eileen, for the intro, and thanks to the fellow panelists. It's a pleasure to be with you here, also all those who tuned into the session. I think that was a great kickoff, and I've heard quite a number of things I would like to reflect on. Let me recall, we are in a decade of action for nutrition, and I think that should guide our, I would say, focus on what we do on in the area of nutrition. And we have a number of frameworks which are there, like SDG 2, Zero Hunger. We have since 1948 a right to food, including adequate nutrition, that has been elaborated as a human right, including micronutrients, access to affordable micronutrients. So I think the framework is there. You really need to translate that in action, and it starts, like Joel has put forward, with, I think, a unified voice. And we have in nowadays, and I think that's a progress I would like to underscore, we have, I mean, a number of institutions and platforms also that can disseminate, I would say, research towards concrete policy and subsequently also action, which is not only the Micronutrient Forum, it's also scaling up nutrition. So, I mean, 10 years ago, nutrition was even more fragmented. So I do not want to echo these fairly pessimistic voices. I would also say, I mean, we have more than a half full glass on the structures that can really help to channel investments. And if I look at the different interventions, I think we have seen progress on the supplementation side. We have seen progress on biofortification. We have seen scaling up large-scale fortification with iodized salt being universal. I think a great example to learn from. A great example to learn from for oil and flour fortification. We have a lot of social safety schemes, which I think can transport nutrition. And on the diversification side, well, there's work to be done. And when it comes to Eileen saying, well, nutrition is too important to leave it to nutritionists, let me add to leave it to nutritionists alone. Because I think nutrition is so multidimensional and so multisectoral that it's impossible, I think, out of an academic nutritionist perspective, to kind of make a difference if we don't leave our comfort zones and if we don't add, I would say, different perspective and capacities to the very, very exciting area of food and nutrition. And when coming back to the voice, I think we learned over the last 10 years, we can talk about what happens if you're undernourished, about the really bad pictures of undernourished children and stunting and wasting. But we can also tell a positive story. A positive story of all the beauty nutrition, if it's adequate, can unfold, which is, it's one of the best investments into human development. I think we must not forget that. So we need an economic thinking on that. Telling politicians, well, it's a great investment in your productivity, in your adult work productivity, but also in education, so future productivity, to take the economists along. I think there's a great opportunity in data and digitization. I think data is not just scientific data, it's also utilizing data in a smarter and better way. And the last 5 years of IT progress, and you also see that in low and middle income countries, and there's a huge opportunity. I largely agree with Kelly. I mean, policy, I think, is not just informed by scientific papers being published, but I think policy in particular need to come also together with the private sector. because it's the private sector producing the food, whether it's healthy, not healthy, fortified or not fortified. And I think there is an interface where, I mean, I think more emphasis should be given on the interface between policy and the private sector. And ultimately, in times of COVID, I mean, nutrition is an excellent investment into health and creates resilience, and it's important for the immune system. So vitamins like vitamin A, D, and zinc, I think are critical to defend infections of various kinds. Not only short-term, but long-term. Let me kind of conclude that at the Gates Foundation, we are in nutrition strategy refresh. That means we take a fresh look on our priorities. We have various areas of, let's say, nutrition engagement, which we would like to highlight a little bit more than in the past, the large-scale fortification piece. I think there's a lot of beauty in the scalability. It's market-based, but it's also an unfinished agenda. So I think only food that really is adequately fortified and reaches the vulnerable, the poor, the people at risk, and maybe also acutely malnourished. I think this impact is something we need to generate better compliance data. We need to be more systemic and kind of drag, I think, innovation in that field. So with the tools from 5 or 10 years ago, I think we're stopping short in fully deploying that potential. And this said, I think we should align ourselves as donors also in our strategies and implementation, because there is no single bullet for nutrition. So I think in complementarity lies the beauty of a holistic strategy that really is sustainable and impactful. Thanks.
Thank you for those insightful comments, Andreas. Let me clarify, though. The quote about nutrition is too important to be left to nutritionists is not my quote. I was quoting somebody else because I obviously don't believe that. But anyway, now we turn to our last but not least speaker, Gerda, to provide some comments.
Thank you very much, Eileen, and thank you very much, colleagues. I have been nodding my head for about 45 minutes because I agree with a lot of what has been said. Now, let me focus a little bit more on the how issue, because I have heard a lot of problems, but I'm used to look at problems as a challenge, and from challenges you can create opportunities. And let me just mention some challenges and what to do about it. One of the biggest challenge is that many people do not understand the distinction between nutrition and food security, as Joe Spicer has said. And I was one of them. I have been the Minister of Agriculture, Nature and Food Quality in the Netherlands, so food quality was there. I was very much aware of the impact of the quality of food on your health. I was not aware only of the impact on the cognitive development, and I was not aware of the impact of good nutrition on the well-being. And when I use this story in meetings with prime ministers or vice prime ministers or minister of finance, and they hear this story for the first time, they understand it. And I had a minister of Malawi who was 72 and who was requested by the president to have an early morning meeting with me. And he was a little bit grumpy that he was sent by the president. But when he heard the story, he said, why did I need to turn 72 before I ever heard this story? So let us get the story right and the understanding of the importance of nutrition. And that we need to get nutrition right in one go with the food security. There is no distinction between food security and nutrition because you are missing a lot of opportunities. But get the knowledge and the know-how right, the basics right, and then make the socio-economic case. Put yourself in the shoes of policy advisors and policy decision makers. Be aware of the fact that nutrition is a multi-sectoral approach. Very often it's considered as a health approach. That's not true because it starts with prevention. It starts with good support of girls and pregnant women and breastfeeding, etc., but also with healthy and affordable food. So it's multi-sectoral and stand next to people. The next challenge is the fact that science and know-how and research is not just recognized anymore. Too often I hear that this research and that knowledge is just another opinion. And that's a big risk. So instead of selling your truth, put yourself in the shoes of the one that you have the conversation with, in order to take him or her with you, or to take the audience and make the audience and the participants part of the conversation and part of the ownership. And then I think the fact that there need to be convergence and coherence with other parts. Never, ever until 2030 at least, we can do without the focus on nutrients, not only when it comes to the cure, the support of people, not only in emergencies, but also to get food systems right. Be at the table, be ready to support thinking and having the conversation on how to get food systems right, from which the results will be presented in the Food Systems Summit next year. In every country, there will be at least, there will be hopefully 3 food systems dialogues. Be at the table to look at perspectives and opportunities from a country perspective, from the perspective of the government, from the perspective of local governments, communities, so that solutions can be found building from what is there. And that means that there needs to be a tweak in the approach of many programs, which is now very often giving the impression, all right, we have the budget, we can do the research, so it's a little bit supply driven, because then you need to try to sell the outcomes of your research and your findings. Turn it around and put yourself in the shoes of those who are the demanders, or should be the demanders, and who should be the clients, and then build your argumentation from there. It requires collaboration, much more between the nutrition specific and the nutrition sensitive, between the health and between the sustainability players. They are still in their silos, but they need to leave their silos, because only if we are breaking down silos, not only in nutrition, but also in sustainability, social protection, health, agriculture and food production, we will be able to join forces, have fun, because the solutions will be unprecedented and will create win-wins for small food producers, for people who are there for special treatment, for clients, and for communities. Finally, and coming back to the quote that Eileen was using, too often, I'm not from within nutrition, and it's clear to you, but too often I hear the term, we as nutrition community. Please ban this word, because as soon as you start to talk about the nutrition community, you are putting up the silos, and you are excluding too many people who need to be involved, who need to be attracted, who need to be at the table and at the implementation place, and be part of the potential win-wins, because nutrition is the best gift for children, but for everyone and for every country, to create a prosperous future, leaving no one behind. Thanks.
Gerda, I can tell you've, in addition to your role at Sun, you've had some practical experience a la being Minister of Agriculture, and it shows in your comments. But so we have a lot of questions coming in, but let me start with one to get this going. You reminded me, Gerda, the scaling up nutrition movement, and I want this to be the whole panel. And as I said earlier, Kelly's joining the panel. I was in a meeting. I was part of an initial planning group before it was even called SUN, but it was December 2009, meeting at UNICEF New York City. Very contentious meeting. And I remember David Nabarro saying, it almost looked like SUN wasn't going to happen. It was called something else back then. But anyway, I remember David saying, I know we have disagreements across this group, but is there enough that we can agree on to move this forward? And so I'll start with Gerda, but I'd like other people to chime in on the panel. How do you get the nutrition community, whatever that is, to speak with one voice?
It's difficult and it's not necessary. What everyone involved in nutrition needs to do is be ready to put him or herself into the shoes of countries and take it from a country perspective. Where is a country? Where is Senegal? What does Senegal want to prioritize? What does Malawi, Vietnam want to prioritize? And how can you build it from there? Not only tackling a challenge through a program or a project, but also thinking, how do we build the capacity or support capacity building to find systemic changes so that people can drive their own nutrition in the future. And maybe what was happening in 2009 is still needed, that global actors need to be ready to leave their egos and logos at the door as soon as they pass the border and step into a mode of how can we contribute, how can we align behind the priorities in this country. And that is what SUN will do. SUN will do, the SUN movement will do, of which several of you are already a member, and the rest is wholeheartedly invited to become, because this is the platform that builds from a country perspective, and that is the way forward.
Gerda, as always, you did a good pitch for SUN. Hopefully Andreas will join. I'd like to join. I don't know what role I'd have, but anyway. This is going to be a specific question for Kelly, but I'd like others on the panel to chime in. And I'll say, Kelly, unfairly, and I want to underscore unfairly, sometimes you as an individual are seen as somewhat anti-private sector. Now, in some of the discussion thus far, we talked about a food systems approach, and I think that's gaining popularity, but how do you think we can better engage the private sector in food nutrition as part of the solution to malnutrition in all its forms, rather than part of the problem?
Thanks, Eileen. That's an issue that we've struggled with for many years about the.
And I said, Kelly, I don't see you as anti-private sector, but that's sometimes the persona that people see you as. I'll mute myself.
No, I completely understand that. You know, we've been in real struggles with the industry on on issues that are fundamentally important to them. As I said before, with soda taxes, the industry has fought that just about harder than anything else they've ever fought. On the issue of food marketing, the industry fiercely wants to protect their right to do that, their ability to do that, because it's so important for their profits and brand loyalty that extends over many years. So I certainly understand that. So my feeling, and I don't know whether my idea is correct or not, the way I'm conceptualizing this, but I see there are places sometimes where industries and industry's priorities and public health priorities align, and then it's great to work together. There are many cases where that's not true, and then the issue is how to best interact with industry. And my feeling is that industry can be incentivized by changes in consumer demands, for example, in ways that would help provide a means for them to change, and that's good, and we can help drive that as much as we can. But there are some places, as I said, where the priorities just aren't aligned, and then the issue about how to fight or challenge industry becomes really important. And my own sense in the areas that we work is that Industry really won't move until they have to, if they're protecting some important part of their business. They will act as if they're going to move by creating self-regulatory structures and promises that they can police themselves. But those, at least in our area, haven't amounted to much. And then they have to be forced to do things, either by changing public opinion, by regulatory threats, or by legislative threats. And then you can work with them in that space where they feel they have to move. And then after that progress has been made, then you apply more pressure and then maybe move ahead a little bit more. So, there are lots of examples of that. So some cases you can work with industry just great because the priorities are aligned, but that's not true all the time. And then the issue is how do you create policy and public pressure on them to change?
Eileen, I only partly agree with what Kelly is saying, because things are moving.
Good. Let's have a debate.
I think there are more and more companies who want to be part of the solution, and they understand their self-interest. They understand that they want to be part of the solution in order to make sure that they have market share within 5 and 10 years. And they have employees who are motivated to work for them because they are investing in those things that people find important. Climate and health, that is what people find important. And it's not all the private sector companies. What is missing is sometimes the will of civil society or the guts in decision makers and maybe scientists to have a proper conversation with them. Only if you sit at the table and you're able to make clear what you expect them to do, then you can have a meaningful conversation, because then they can say, this is what we can do, this will take it, etc. And then from a government perspective, I'm always interested in thinking about taxes, but then the revenues of the taxes need to be looped back to improve and to improve further nutrition actions. So never forget this. But I want to see incentives and taxes going hand in hand in order to make it possible to comply. Thanks.
I mean, can I chip something in there?
Absolutely.
Yes, thank you. And I'd like to follow on from what Gerda said, which I think is really important. Maybe by a quick way of disclosure. So I have a business career, so I'm not coming through the development sector. I've spent the past 25 years in consulting and finance and more in a business environment, building startups to some extent. And for me, I was really surprised about the lack of dialogue that sometimes really is happening in the development sector. I've never seen it in any other sector, and I've seen really a few to that extent, also to the part of being outright hostile. And what we're looking at very practically at the moment is, because we want to engage on some of the important questions with corporates, is like on what frameworks, how do we engage with them? What is the rule set, how we can do this? Because we also have to understand on what do we engage with them? On the policy side, this might be a whole lot more important, but coming back to my earlier argument, we also need to understand the operational sides, and corporates are really super good at operations. They've practiced it for many, many years longer. They understand how it works. They also have a lot of the data we need for effective implementations, because they understand the markets, which in the development sector would be the food system or the healthcare system or the education system. These companies view these areas as markets, and they have done market research on this, which is hugely valuable data we're not having any chance of tapping into and actually using it for a more effective implementation. And that's because we're not having them at the table, because we're not engaging. So I think we're facing really complex problems, and I don't think we can leave out any skill set that's available on the planet to solve them. And there is an important skill set, which is in the context of corporates. So for me, this hostility, I do see the problems. I mean, I'm not naive, and I do see the problems on the policy side, but non-engagement is not the solution to it. It's building rules and building frameworks of how we can, and then bring them in and make sure we enter into these discussions and then move this forwards, but using our skill sets in a sensible way. So that would be my view on that topic.
Eileen, can I add on that?
Absolutely, absolutely.
I think it's a really great discussion because it focuses on the private sector and the roles. And when I was in the initial kickoff meeting of the UN Global Compact 20 years ago, I think there was so much hostile environment at the UN, seeing private sector very much as part of the problem. And I think it changed 20 years ago to also see it as part of the solution. And I think I perfectly agree. The obesity pandemic, there's a lot of products, I think, where the consumers, educated consumers, need to have better information. And I hope that smartphones at one day will tell us buy this and not that. It's bad for your health. It's going to make you overweight. It may destroy your teeth. The consequences are always long-term. They are not really visible. And I think we need to empower the consumer to make the right choices. For me, that is, I think, the best route into reformulation of products to be more healthy. But I agree with Gerda, the consumers get more empowered, and I think they make the right choices. So I think it's time to embark on that journey and help to empower the consumers to do these choices. But on the other hand, I think we also have a lot of companies that really do great stuff for nutrition. And if you look at universal salt iodization in 140 countries, I mean, you know how many salt producers these are, which haven't asked to carry iodine to the people? Do you know how many flour mills in countries like Nigeria, Tanzania, in Kenya out there, which haven't been asked to transport folic acid, iron, and B vitamins to malnourished people? And you know, I mean, how much it took the development community to change the perspective of these private sectors to see poverty not as an obstacle, but also as an opportunity to empower a nation and their customers. So I think there's examples for good systems change in food systems, and regulation and standards kind of coming from a best practice that becomes a good practice, becoming a standard practice, becoming a normative practice, becoming the only practice at one point of time, monitored with data. I think that's a route we in food systems should look into very carefully. What can we learn, for example, from large-scale fortification in other areas to kind of get a normative level playing field? And I think private sector is often willing to raise the bar, and in particular large companies sometimes are, if at the end of the day there's a level playing field and everybody participates. And I think that's then a matter of smart regulation and also politicians that understand not to regulate against the private sector, but regulate a market for public good. Thanks.
Eileen, could I bring it back to the opportunity space around COVID for a moment?
Absolutely. There's going to be a delay when I respond because I mute myself, but absolutely, Joe, go ahead.
Great, thanks. So first, just to say, you know, I put out a rather stark frame in the beginning, but in actual fact, I'm an optimist and a dreamer with a strong pragmatic streak. So at Nutrition International, we work really with a bias towards action and a sense of urgency around this. So it's in that light that I just want to call out two things that I think we can be doing where there is a huge upside, an opportunity side, let's say, the opportunity in the crisis that is COVID. Let me be very propositional for a moment. So some of the panelists have talked about the importance of giving high quality, data-driven, evidence-based guidance to countries so they can invest for maximum impact. I strongly second that. I would say as a community, let's prioritize and scale up low-cost, high-impact and evidence-based interventions that save lives and alter human trajectories. That doesn't mean not doing other things, but to be very specific, I'm talking about breastfeeding, vitamin A. I mean, 100 million children just missed their first round of vitamin A this year. That's something we're really wrestling with along with partners. Multiple micronutrient supplements have I think there are many people that have been pulling their hair out wishing we could move faster on this, but it's ready. Treatment of wasting, critical. Fortification is critical. And then as panelists have said, let's innovate around delivery, be strategic in our execution, align our efforts and scale up with an emphasis on building government capability to do so. So we've talked about the success story, the public health success story of scaling up iodized salt. What a wonderful highway we have built down which to run value-added traffic like double fortified salt. Let's not miss those opportunities, right? And while we're talking about opportunities, I'd like to see much more of a mindset of a no missed opportunities approach in nutrition and getting better at spotting them. It's outside our echo chamber of self-congratulation as people keep encouraging us to look outside. I think about social safety net programs. That's been discussed at different parts of the panel. 1.8 billion people are now covered because of COVID by social safety net programs, but they're not optimized for nutrition. So more nutritious foods, fortified foods, opportunities to connect people with non-food nutrition and health services. This can revolutionize SSNPs for nutrition. So we're very excited to be working with Andreas and his team on this, for example. Let's not forget, just coming down the road is the G7 meeting hosted by the UK. And Boris Johnson's, one of his top priorities is education for girls. Surely this is a great opportunity for our community. And Gerda, I'm still kind of shaking my head about you saying there is no nutrition community. So maybe we can come back to that. I consider myself part of one. And if there isn't one, I would like people that are focused on action to tell me where to sign up, because that's where I'd like to go. But nutrition is an education investment after all, right? But that discussion about making education and making kids school ready, that's an opportunity for us. Education has way more money and priority than nutrition does. And finally, on immunization, when they finally do roll out a COVID vaccine, let's make sure that's not the greatest missed opportunity for the nutrition community that there is. Because what a great opportunity in some countries to make sure that we're adding services as well. Right now, emergency measles catch-up campaigns are rolling out with no vitamin A and no nutrition at all, within 30 days of vitamin A and deworming campaigns for the same populations. We are paying twice to reach the same people in the middle of a global pandemic. This is a classic example of a missed opportunity. And I don't say that as a negative, I say that as a positive, because wow, what an awful lot we can do that is within our reach to put nutrition higher and have a real effect on people. So I'll step off my soapbox now. Thank you, Eileen, for that.
That was helpful, Joel. So I want to address the next question to Katerina and you, but let's start with Katerina. You both have mentioned breastfeeding. And I consider breastfeeding the third rail of nutrition politics, meaning if you're not for breastfeeding, you're against it. I don't know why I have to justify this, but I breastfed my 3 children. But I was up in Congress testifying once, and I remember one of the congressmen saying in a program in the US called the Women, Infants, and Children Program, we should mandate or force women to breastfeed. I don't know how you do that. But I think it's we make women feel bad. And let me, I was at a convocation, an international convocation, as it happened, sponsored by Sight and Life Foundation. Klaus Kramer championed this, but I had the special envoy from the United Nations. It doesn't matter anyway. But the point she was making was, we talk about breastfeeding, and we often don't, we only look at it narrow vision from the point of view of the child. Let me be clear, speeches I've given over the years, breastfeeding is the optimum form of infant feeding. No debate there. But when we have these discussions, we ignore the mother. And so I'd like to start with you, Katerina, and then Joel. There are women, for whatever reason, who choose not to breastfeed. And you see the same data I see, Katerina, which is in some of the urban areas in developing countries, rates of breastfeeding are actually coming down. What is the nutrition message or for these women who want to do the best for their infants, but for whatever reason choose not to breastfeed? What's the message from your side?
That's a tough one. I mean, I think, first of all, coming back to one of the points you said is we're putting a lot of pressure on the women, and that's true. In all fairness, I think in many, many instances, it's not even the decision of the woman. We've just been through a major project for our foundation where we really look at and try to understand better, because I would claim we don't really understand why women breastfeed or don't, right? It's not quite often their decisions. We have elements where we understand the environment around her, but we have no concise framework that helps us to understand in the right context why women breastfeed or not, or have an analysis tool that would help us. We're trying to address that, right? So if women can't breastfeed, and I'm probably going to be shot dead for saying this, but
no, Katerina,
I think
not just can't breastfeed,
or don't want to. And I think it's a personal choice. I think the next alternative is turning to formula. There are not that many options, right? I think as long as the women really understand what they're doing, and there, I'm afraid, is that where the sort of model breaks down, or their environment understands what they're doing. Because I think there's still a vast amount of people who equate breastfeeding to I feed my child. And I think this is a just extremely big misconception. And if you think about it this way, it's an easy switch to do, right? Because here, kids grow great if you give them a bottle. Kids grow maybe a little less fast if you give them a breast. So if you focus on quantitative growth, it's actually an obvious one to use the bottle, because boom, you get faster, a bigger baby. Great. But I think what people don't understand is that technically breast milk is another 6 months of extra uterine development, because we're actually, by the fact that we're walking upright, have to deliver earlier, and we're missing out on 6 months of having the baby still in our womb. So breast milk isn't food. Breast milk accidentally also provides the nutrients that the baby needs to grow, but it's actually a development agent. It has, I mean, anybody who looks at what's in breast milk is the life component is extraordinary. We have the gut that's populated by the bacteria. We have an endocrine exchange. We have microRNA. We have all kinds of antibodies, immune protection. We're having stem cells that are passed on that we don't know yet really what the effect is, but they are absorbed into the child's body. We know that we have a strong epigenetic imprint on the child. So what we're doing here is that we're providing development agent to the child in a critical phase, and we're protecting it at the same time from a lot of the environmental stresses and dangers that these very young, essentially still fetuses, if you would think of it in an evolutionary context, aren't even able to capture. So I think we can muse all day long is how are we going to talk and what is the alternative to breastfeeding? In some places, it's outright dangerous not to breastfeed because the water quality is so poor. But I think we're seeing an effect where, and I'm always amazed how little, I mean, not that I knew a whole lot when I started my job as being the head of the foundation, but despite being a trained scientist, but it's flabbergasting how little it's actually known. So people are taking decisions on an information base that is extremely incomplete, and that's not just the mother. This is actually her entire community, or what is actually around her and is counseling her. And I think there's another thing we don't really address, and it's the really big asymmetry of the economics in breastfeeding. And this is that the entire economic burden is on the mother or her family, while the entire benefit of breastfeeding is actually spread throughout society, because it comes much later in life, and it's coming through a lot of saved money in the healthcare system. So we're not making sure that people really understand what decisions they're taking. So if we take this decision on food versus food, yeah, that's one decision, but I don't think that's the right decision. And at the same time, we're not addressing the fact that it's not on the mother quite often, and we're not addressing the imbalance and the asymmetry of the economic situation. So I think, yes, I mean, what is the recommendation? I don't think there is a good recommendation. I think there is an effort to make breastfeeding understood better, as it's important, as a really important nutritional component of a critical development window. And by the way, not only for the child, because we know mothers are more healthy, and we're protecting a lot of human capital on the side of the mother by allowing and supporting her to breastfeed. We're only focusing on the child and its health, but it's actually also helping the mothers to stay healthy, as long as her nutritional status is at the point where it's not damaging her to do so. And we have situations, and we can't dance around that handbag either, where breastfeeding is actually impacting mother's health negatively, because she's at a nutritional status where she can't cope with it, actually. I mean, there's not too many women, but there's still a good number and a frighteningly high number of those women who are in this bucket. So I think we need to differentiate that discussion. There's no easy answer as far as I'm concerned.
Well,
Right,
and
right.
it's a little bit hypothetic discussion in the 62 member countries where the Sun movement is, because getting breastfeeding right is the most important. How to get rid of those habits where children are first given some water or some tea or some sugar before the mother start breastfeeding. How do we avoid that chiefs have an interest in breast milk substitute selling, etc., and is paid by some companies or some connected companies. So and maybe women or families can afford to have make the decision how to support their children with or without breastfeeding. But in most situations where Sun movement people are operating, it's no choice. It's just getting the guidance, the support of girls and women, and the breast milk, the breast feeding guiding right.
And Eileen, I'd add briefly just that breastfeeding sits at the crossroads of the health system, the social protection system, and the food system as the first vaccine for the child. I would like to see, I mean, colleagues have really hit it properly, this question, but I think that underscores for me the importance of more focus on maternal nutrition as well. And I think there's an opportunity there also hiding in plain view to have more global alignment and action on maternal nutrition. That's something I think we should see in the coming year.
Yeah.
Thank you. We're going to run out of time. We have lots and lots of questions. So let me thank you. Just FYI, when I deal with my students, I refer to breast milk as liquid gold. But anyway, I'd like to turn to Ali Andreas, because this whole issue of financing, and you both represent, in part, donor organizations. Joel mentioned a country in which he's working, didn't name it. At the moment, I have active program of research in 3 countries, Sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. And what I hear is that the donors drive, in part, the donors drive the agenda. And specifically, the Decade of Action on Nutrition talks about malnutrition in all its forms. And the sense is, I'll just tell you from these 3 countries, the sense is that there still is a focus on the undernutrition part of the continuum. I understand that. But when researchers go in and talk about, well, let's look at overweight, obesity, non-communicable diseases, they say, fine, but the donors are not there. And so let me start with Ali and then Andreas. But Ali, is your World Bank, the financing facility, is there at the moment particular efforts to concentrate on overweight and obesity? I'm going to put myself on mute.
Eileen, at what time do you intend to stop? Because I have another obligation any minute now.
I think I have 2 minutes left, but if you want to disengage, I understand, Gerda, because your time, everyone's time is valuable, particularly yours. So no problem.
Yes, thanks, Eileen, for the question. Yes, I think as you probably saw, the World Bank also just launched a big report on particularly on this issue. And I think for us, and again, when we talk about this issue, right, basically the nutrition, I think we're really trying to link it to the sort of broader health, broader health program, and in this case through the UHC, right? And then a lot of the discussion about the UHC is also about preventing future sort of healthcare costs. And I think this issue on the obesity and how it links to the non-communicable disease, I think sort of that narrative and how it basically linked to the success of the country to achieve universal health care, which is not only about improving access to healthcare, but also about financial protection, right? Which is about then trying to reduce the financial catastrophic spending because of the healthcare cost, because when they have like a big sort of NCD, which normally basically it costs a lot for treatment. So I think sort of this, yeah. So to short answer to your question, yes, I think we're looking into that, and we're really trying to link that narrative to the broader UHC, which includes sort of how to basically, if we invest it now, it will help in preventing to reduce the healthcare cost in the future, which is one of the big component of the UHC in terms of financial protection. Thank you.
Thanks, Ali. Andreas, unfortunately, we can't hear your response to this, but I'm getting a message from the organizers that I need to tie this up. Let me just end with the sub-theme of this discussion was enabling environment. I don't think we got into that as much as we might have. And my bias, I'll state this right now, is sometimes the availability of technical solutions to malnutrition in all its forms is not enough. And when we think about political economy issues like institutions, actors, vested interests, we really need to work that side of the agenda much more than we have. Apologies to everyone on this panel. We could have gone on for another 2 hours. It shows the caliber of people who have participated in this. But let me again thank all the presenters, all the panelists, and let me say this is going to be a to-be continued discussion. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Eileen.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thanks, Eileen. Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
everyone.
Bye. Take care.